Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and you're going to be joining me on a little family history tour. We're in Northiam in East Sussex, and this little path leads up to the church. This little path and its way hasn't changed in 800 odd years, so we know that our ancestors, our Tufton ancestors, and one or two of the Wakehurst ones, would have walked up this path every Sunday to church, when they christened their children, when they married, and to funerals. Our main port of call, our main ancestors that we're going to be discussing today are Sir Nicholas Tufton, his wife Lady Margaret Tufton, a little of her parents, and a little of Nicholas's parents and grandparents. Interesting ancestors. Sir Nicholas's father, Sir Nicholas, and Sir Nicholas's son, who we now know survived into adulthood, all share three things in common, or one thing in common. All three of them shared one thing in common, that each one of them married a very rich heiress who had no brothers, so was heir or co-heir to their father's fortunes. So this is how the family tallied up its money. We're coming up to the entrance now, guys and girls. This little route would have been taken by Sir Nicholas, his wife, his children, and his parents many times. And I must say a massive thank you to John, to Helen, and to Barbara, all associated with this church, for your massive help with me with these new documents, and for helping with the translation of Latin to English, which is something I've never been able to do, and that's been quite a big breakthrough with this little family, is that we've now got someone who's willing to help us translate the documents, and bless them, they're willing to do it free of charge, because it's very expensive to get done otherwise. And we now have Sir Nicholas's will, the will of his grandfather, and the will of his father-in-law. Sir Nicholas's own will is very interesting, and it shows that by the time he died in 1538, his wife was already dead. And it shows that he obviously still thought enough of his mother and father-in-law to order prayers to be said for their souls, and ordered prayers to be said for his soul, his wife's soul, and the souls of all the faithful, which he would have had to pay for. His monument he would have had to pay for, of course, as well. And in his will, which was written the year before his death, he seems to have planned and made everything ready. Although Sir Nicholas was aged 58 or 59, which doesn't seem very old to us, when he died, that's how old he was, in the Tudor era, he would have been classed as an old man who'd lived beyond his life expectancy. And we're going to be going into the church in a minute and visiting a little of our family history and seeing the tomb of our ancestor Sir Nicholas. The church tower is the oldest surviving part of the church, with this door and this archway having been well in place when our ancestors were here, so we know that they would have walked through there. And in we go. I'm doing the voiceover for this instead of my original talk, which was on the original video, because I've got so much more information, some of which corrects information that we previously had that was wrong, such as our fault that Sir Nicholas's son had died before him, because his will mainly covers his two daughters, whose one's our direct ancestress, and her sister. And being in those days that a father would have passed his wealth and everything on to the son, it was putting two and two together and thinking that the son had died. It wasn't that. The son had married so well and such a wealthy heiress that his wealth exceeded his father's. So the fathers decided to leave the daughters well off, because the son was already very well catered for. The son was left the house and some of the land, but the real valuables were left between the two daughters, who unfortunately went to court over that and fought it out between the pair of them. This is the chancel of the church, and what we need to bear in mind and keep this in mind, in those days, people in church, there wasn't pews like we have now. People stood, the rich and the poor. Only the sick, old or very lame, were allowed to sit, usually on trestle or stone benches along the side of the church. To the right of us here, where you see this little bit of Victorian tiling, was where St Nicholas's tomb originally was. A stone slab with the brass image on it and the plaque underneath. The plaque still survives visibly, which we're going to go and see in a minute. What I didn't know at the time, and this has peeved me a bit, right where I'm standing on this red carpet, literally right underneath me, still survives the brass image of our ancestor. But that'll be something to see on my next visit. And what I'm pointing out there is that the altar in those days used to be more forward than it was, and you had a screen where the sacrament would have been prepared behind, and to each side of that screen was a shrine or another altar, one to St Nicholas and the other one to St Margaret. They were taken away in the Reformation, but our ancestor in his will gave orders that he was to be buried before the shrine of St Nicholas. This church, as I say, had big renovations in the Victorian era. And here we go into the side aisle to see what remains of our ancestors' tomb, really, what visibly remains. And as you can see, the only bit of it visible to us, or readable to us, that I'm pointing at now, is his name, Nicholas Tufton. The rest of it's all in Latin. Everything was in, especially for higher up people in those days, was in Latin. But basically the plaque reads that here lies Sir Nicholas Tufton. A little thing has been solved here. We thought he was sheriff, and went on thinking that for a long time. He wasn't sheriff. He was nominated to be sheriff 3 times, and this plaque has solved that little thing, because the person who, with the Latin speaker, says that it's wanted 3 times sheriff of this county. So they wanted him to be sheriff 3 times, and from documents recently found out, found out that he turned it down 3 times. From his brass image that's on the floor, which I'm really grateful for being sent a picture of, the vicar of the church now has sent it to a friend of his who's kind of an expert in medieval history, and he's been able to tell us something from the brass image of our ancestor. 2 things. One, that he was a modest man, because rather than being shown in his knightly status, because he was a knight, so most knights on their graves, like Sir Nicholas's grandfather, are shown in their suits of armour and things. Sir Nicholas chose to be shown in his civilian clothing. And also, we can see by the top of his head that our ancestor lost the hair on the top of his head by the time he died. These brass images are obviously nothing like photographs or completely accurate lifelike depictions, but they did try to add as much what they called lively detail, which was lifelike detail, as possible. So it's a nice little thing to go off, something I never would have thought of, and what this expert told me. Thank you very much to John for that. That we know that just from the brass image that Sir Nicholas was quite a modest man and going bald. Yeah, this little plaque here is at the bottom. It says Deus Amen, which means God, Amen. The verse at the bottom bit means that he died in the faith of God, Amen, which means he wasn't a heretic, and he died shriven, which was with the last rites and everything like that. We know from the coroner's inquest, and they didn't go into great detail unfortunately, that Sir Nicholas died from falling off of his horse on the Northiam Road, which is the road that goes from Rye to Northiam. It was the 30th of December, bearing in mind the feast time of Christmas in those days. So he may have been going to see family or friends or doing whatever, but he was pissed on his way back, fell off. We don't know whether he broke his neck or bashed his head or hypothermia got him, but we do know that he was taken home and died several hours later, and that no fine was given to the local area, which could have been done if they thought something had been done to him in his will. What we're looking at here is the Tufton coat of arms, and that's where I said earlier about people standing, and bear that in mind, because this possibly denotes where our ancestors would have stood in church. Like later on when pews came along and the richer families had their own pew, before pews, the family's badge would be up on the wall or on a stained glass window or something. And this is St Nicholas's coat of arms. St Nicholas's parents are both buried in this church as well. Quite where, we don't know. There may have been a monument to him, very likely was. But bearing in mind they both died before the Reformation, it would have been filled with Catholic symbolism and was very likely taken away. Hence also why St Nicholas's and his wife's original memorial was so botched to pieces. By the time the Victorians came along, all that remained was the brass nameplate and the brass image of him. One of those items, believe it or not, ended up in a Brighton curiosity shop for a while, and was only in fairly some time ago reunited with the grave. As I say, we've got a fair bit of information now, more information than we had. We've got the will, some of the coroner's inquest things, Sir Nicholas's grandfather's will, and been able to solve a little mystery here with Great Dixter House. Sir Nicholas's father didn't build Great Dixter. His grandfather, Sir Richard Wakehurst, built that. Sir Nicholas appears in the records of being there in his early life, which shows he may have been raised there, as often done in the households of gentry, that you would send your sons and daughters to be raised elsewhere to learn how to be ladies and gentlemen. And this is the Fruin Chantry Chapel, or Fruin Mausoleum Chapel, and where I just pointed there is the entrance down into the crypt. I have been in the crypt before, when I went to the church on my first visit, which was some years ago now. And this crypt isn't like one of our nice clean London crypts, it is full of bones, hence why I will never take pictures or video down there, because it's not respectful. But down in the crypt, over in the corner there, the wall and the stone pillar, that's mirrored down below, and just in the wall where down below in the crypt are 3 alcoves. In the bottom one is our ancestor St Nicholas, who's buried in a lead sealed coffin. Above, the alcove, slightly smaller but adult size still, is bricked up. That's his wife, and she's likely buried in a wooden coffin or possibly a burial shroud. The smallest alcove above, and I had to jump to see in that one because I'm quite a short ass, is filled with tiny little bones and pieces of wood, which are the infant children of Sir Nicholas and Lady Margaret that died in infancy. But yeah, it was a bit of an eerie one, that, and having been sealed in lead, anyone that's interested in that kind of thing, type in a program called Medieval Dead, The Man in the Lead. When you're sealed in lead, it's revolting, but you don't decompose. And this happened to a man known as the Man in the Lead. Went to the Crusades, died, was sealed in lead and brought back home and buried. The abbey in which he was buried was destroyed in the Reformation. Hundreds of years later, an archaeological dig happens and they find the sealed coffin with him in it, open it up, and to their astonishment find a completely preserved medieval man inside. And this is where I'm just pointing out where the alcoves are down below. So that's very likely the state in which our ancestor may be, because it is sealed. Unusual that he's buried in a sealed lead coffin. It may have been done for several reasons. When he died, it was in the height of the sweating sickness, although he didn't die of that. Possibly may have been suspected of having it. The most likely reason is our family had money, and with Sir Nicholas and his little branch, it was not new money, but kind of new money. They'd come into their big inheritances through their grandmothers-in-law, so maybe it was showing off. Possibly. So yeah, that's a little bit of our ancestors' tale inside the church. And we look here, And we see his name, Sir Nicholas Tufton. And this little thing would have been carved in 1538 and laid on his grave when the church was very, very different. Churches in those days would have been much more colourful and filled with the sound of Latin chanting and incense and such like. Also, interestingly enough, something I found out, women wouldn't have attended funerals in those days, so his daughters and sisters, whoever female relatives remaining, wouldn't have gone. It was a man's thing, and most people, especially higher up people, were buried in the evening for some reason. I don't know why. So we can imagine our family, the male members of it, walking up that little track with Sir Nicholas on an evening. He died on the 30th of December and was buried in January. In the cold months, they didn't have to bury too quick. Yeah, he's a very interesting man, Sir Nicholas. And we're going to end ourselves on this little bit at something a little more cheerful. And there I'm just pointing out where the outline of the crypt is below. Into the little side chapels where I've just been, there is nothing below that. The crypt only covers the main body of the church. And we'll end at the sacred window. Hope you've all found this little bit interesting, guys and girls. And please join me for the next part of the video, which is documents and new information about Sir Nicholas and the family and Great Dixter. Evening, ladies and gents, and I'll show you the line of descent from my great-great-grandparents and my great-grandmother, dock labourers and factory workers, right back to Sir Nicholas Tufton and his grandparents, Sir Richard and Lady Elizabeth Wakehurst. And here we start with my great-grandparents. I didn't want to start off with grandparents or great-grandparents. It's a bit recent with some of the details and stuff. And this is going on my London Luke page as well, because a couple of people have showed some interest. So this is great-great-grandparents. And in red there is the line of descent through their daughter. I was going to start off with them, but I decided to start off with her parents. Instead, it's nice and long ago, so can't miff anyone or whatnot then. But yeah, this is through the line of descent through great-grandmother Ada. There's Charles, Henrietta, and their daughter Henrietta Jr. There we were just at Henrietta and Charles Henry. Now we're back to Henrietta's parents. Here's Henrietta marked in red below there where I'm moving the mouse. And this is her parents, Joseph Shipp. He was a labourer and became a master greengrocer. And his wife Henrietta. Fair age difference between these two, as you see. He's born in 1826, she's born in 1841. Interestingly enough though, they both died within a year of each other. These are their children. Henrietta Popkiss, who we was just looking at, there she is down here as one of the children, marked in red, and here's her parents. And it's through her mother's line, through the Kite line of the family, that we go back to Sir Nicholas Tufton. And there's a fair few ancestors involved in this one, so if genealogy and family history isn't your thing, definitely give this video a miss. Interesting man, Edward, born in Dover, 1809. He was a shoemaker and repairer, and after 1833 a customs house officer. They moved from Kent to London and he became a customs house officer there. That was obviously for the work. With these two, we don't know for certain whether they broke up or that Edward had saved up the money to send his wife and youngest daughter, Harriet Popkiss, over to America, because that's what these two, Mary Ann and the youngest daughter we saw down there, they both show up in America, in New York. Edward is in London still, and he dies in London of typhus fever. We don't know whether there was a breakup between the two, or whether he'd sent them first and was saving up the money to send himself over there, because their son was already over there. So it seems likely that's possibly what they was going to do. Right, let's pause you a minute and we'll go back through Mary Ann Kite's line. This is my family tree, by the way, the online version. There you've got the big folder version sitting on a great big box full of about £10,000 worth of documents that I've got over the years. I'll pause you and carry you back on. And here we've got our fact sheet on Edward and Mary Ann. Mary Ann remarried to a man named Frederick Vickers. She died of TB, and so did her daughter. Here we are, Mary Ann, who we was just seeing. She's in red there as one of the children, and this is her parents. It's got the relation to myself with the greats and all that at the top there. Pause and read for any details that you want to read. Elizabeth here, her occupation in 1861 was a nurse monthly, which is a nurse for a delicate woman at that time of the month. Victorians did like to do things like that, didn't they? There we was just at John. Now we're seeing him as one of the children over to the right in red, and with his parents. You see, people had quite a lot of children in those days. Thomas Kite, who we was just looking at. We're looking at him here as a child on the left in red, one of many brothers and sisters. This is his parents. Interesting ancestor, this one. Interesting name, Phineas Kite. And an interesting man. Born the son of a baker, he worked his way up, invested, and did really well for himself. Basically, by the time he died, he was classed as a gentleman. He was a grocer, and he invested well in something called the 10% fund. It's mentioned in his will. And when he died, in his will, he left £30,000, which was a big sum of money for someone of this class in those days. His gravestone still survives, but not on the grave like many of the graves that I've shown in my London Loop videos. His gravestone has been moved against the churchyard wall. And it's through his wife, Elizabeth, that we go back to Sir Nicholas Tufton. But look at the number of children that they had. It's just the fact sheet on them. This is his gravestone. This picture was sent to me some years ago, so they're a bit grainy and blurry. The church in churchyard and church where he's buried. And as I said, it was through Elizabeth Young, Phineas's wife, and we're looking at her top child here in red on the left, and this is her parents, Thomas Young. Don't know a great deal about him, unfortunately, other than when they married. His wife, Mary Den, or Denny. Name was originally de Denny. It was the Norman French name. Records for the parish at this era are not great because they had several fires in this parish and accidents and things, so it's very sketchy with records. These are their children, and it is through Mary Denny, or De Denny, that we go back to St Nicholas Tufton. Here we are, and we was looking at Mary Denny. Now we look at her top child on the left, and her parents, Daniel Denny, and her mother, Mary Baldock. It's through Mary's father, through the Denny line, that we go back to St Nicholas Tufton, so on we go. Vincent Denny and Elizabeth Gillow, and it's this ancestor that I was talking about that lost my little branch of the family what money it had. He wouldn't have had a great deal as a younger son, but there we are. And he married Elizabeth, who was a servant, but hopefully they was happy enough together. Their children, with Daniel marked there in red. On we go. Vincent Denny Sr. at the top, the father, and Vincent Denny Jr., who we was just looking at, marked there below, is the youngest son. And as you can see, the records for Deal are not that great. And me, who is a stickler for detail, likes to have all the detail. On to our next set of ancestors. There we are, Vincent Denny Senior, shown in red at the bottom there, and with his parents, William Denny and Margaret. William Denny, he left a will, so we know a little bit about him when he died, and that burial record survived for this man as well. And in his will he left instructions that he was to be buried betwixt his mother and his father in the churchyard at Dill, so we know that he's buried between his mother and his father, and his wife was buried with him. So only 2 children, probably more, died in infancy and things like that, and the parish records being sketchy, it would be quite unusual for people to have just 2 children. Not unheard of, but quite unusual. And on to our next set of ancestors we go. James Denny, and there we see William, who we was just looking at as a child this time, and Johanne, maiden name unknown, is the James's wife and William's his mother, and she died after 1557, and we know that because James Denny, like his son, left a will, and in the will his wife was mentioned, but we can't find no record for her death or burial. So, and these had more children. There we are. That mentions about the wheel there at the bottom. On to the next lot. James Denny, who we saw as a husband, we see as a son at the bottom there in red. And here we have our first Tufton, Agnes Tufton, the daughter of Nicholas and Margaret, and she married top man there, William Denny, and he died in October 1572, also left a will. Their children. You see some of the family names carried on. And here we've got the man himself, Sir Nicholas Tufton. Family name was originally de Tocton, then de Tufton. The de Tocton and de Tufton were the Normandy French names, and as I've said, after the wars with the French they dropped those fast. Born about 1479, Northiam place in Sussex. Died December the 30th, 1538 in Tufton Place in Northiam in Sussex. There's all his details. Occupations: night coroner, steward of Hastings rape, justice of the peace, commissioner of sewers, and nominee for sheriff 3 times. This is one of the new pieces of information. Whereas I thought that he was sheriff 3 times, it wasn't. It's now been translated from his grave plate that he was 3 times wanted sheriff. So they nominated him 3 times. And from records that my friends in Norvium, or now friends in Norvium, that have helped me with, we found out that he turned it down 3 times. A new piece of information: we knew they married in 1500. We now know they married in November 1500. And Sir Nicholas married Margaret Heaver, who was the heiress of Sir John Heaver, a descendant of the people who built Heaver Castle, in which later Anne Boleyn would go on to live. And here is more information. The children I only knew about before were Agnes, and John, and I didn't know much about information about John. New information has led us on to John here, who'd become a very interesting man, or his descendants would become the Earls of Thanet through the marriage of John's son to Margaret Sackville. And Margaret Sackville is descended from the Tudor and Plantagenet and Stuart lines of the throne. So we're kind of descended from the Tudors by marriage. Interestingly enough, Sir Nicholas Tufton here and Margaret Heaver, they're the 11 or 12 times great-grandparents of Prince William and Prince Harry, because of the Sackville link. We share a common ancestor. Fact sheet with new stuff, which is the brass memorial plaque, which you'll see a much better copy of. This is the square one that I went and saw myself, if any of you see in the video. Tufton Place, where Sir Nicholas lived as an older man, as a married man, lived and died along with his wife and family. New information has come to light, and it's good, accurate information too, that Great Dixter wasn't built by Sir Nicholas's father. It was built by his grandfather, Sir Richard Wakehurst, and we'll see more of that soon. Sir Nicholas's will. The will is in Latin. Extract. So he asked that his body be buried in the church at Norvium before the altar of St. Nicholas, and he bequeathed to the burial 6 shillings and 8pence, and the stone with his picture on, an inscription thereon. The inscription, little square thing, is what we've seen, and the picture is what I was standing on without even realising it. Cost 26 shillings and 8pence. He left money to the church for the priest to say Mass in the said church for 2 years, for his soul and the souls of William and his father, Alice. And that's a new piece of information, because we didn't know Sir Nicholas Tufton's mother's name before the translation of this document, which we now do. And for the souls of John Heaver and Marianne, who also appears as Anne sometimes, as his mother and father-in-law. And bearing in mind that Sir Nicholas here would have inherited a good chunk of his wealth through his wife, through these people. This is obviously, maybe he liked them as well. There we are, yeah. And Thomas Cryer was his son-in-law. Right, that's our Tuftons, and the next part of our video is going to be looking at some of this new evidence which is much clearer copies than what you've just seen, because this you're looking at on a computer. So I hope you've all enjoyed this part. Join me all for part 2.